And welcome back to another episode of Coaching with the Bible. This is episode 167, season 4, episode 7. I hope and pray that someday soon we get back to those long and introductions. That time is not yet. This week's portion is the portion known as Vayetze, and we deal with very much the life of Jacob, the third of the patriarchs. Our topic this week is on what tips the decision, the concept of tipping points. This episode will go back to more of the style that we had for the first 160 weeks or so in Coaching with the Bible, and we'll explore Jacob in depth. But first, two comments. Number one, as the holiday of Thanksgiving is upon us, those of you who are celebrating, who celebrated yesterday, we're celebrating today, celebrate. It's a tough time in the world right now, but still I think it's important for us to take the time to celebrate, to appreciate, to show gratitude. If you're a religious person, to the one above, to God. If you're not a religious person, but even if you are, to the people that are around you. And really appreciate what you have. If anything has been sort of become clear around us over the last couple of weeks, it's simply just been that you can't take anything for granted. There's a lot of craziness that's going on in the world right now. And for the time that we have it, we have to appreciate it. So that's number one. Number two, it's a heavy day here in Israel, as the first of the hostage prisoner exchanges is to take place today. And a ceasefire went into effect this morning. And I would say that, I know this is for me and other people I feel also, that we're very much on edge. Super nervous about what's going to take place today. Very stressed about just everything going. The idea that it's going to take days and days and weeks to get everybody back. The notion that some of the hostages could take a very long time before they get back. Starting with women and children, we'll move on from there to maybe the injured and the elderly. And at some point, the young men and women who were soldiers or who are of, let's say, a healthy age, who, hopefully they get back soon. So it's a very heavy day. And it's, on some level, torturous. As Douglas Murray described, it's a bit of a water torture. Every day there's a slow drip of hostages coming back. And the idea that we are getting hostages back who are all innocents, being traded for convicted criminals, no matter what their age, convicted criminals. And so it's heavy and it's hard. And we pray for them and we hope for them. We hug them also when they come home and their families. And to be the parents of the children that are not coming home today, and to be a family member of someone who is not being released today, it's agony. It's agony. So those two things, I think, go together a little bit. We're not in that situation. You're not in that situation. And so hug and appreciate the ones that you have, the ones that you love. In our own lives, we make an enormous amount of decisions, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, over the course of many years. Talked about decision making a lot over the last number of weeks. We talked a lot about moral related issues in decision making in the last week, certainly. And it's still there as a thing for me. It's still an issue that I want to pursue at a greater length and a greater depth. Many of the decisions that we make are sort of inane or innocuous or meaningless or quick and don't require a lot of thought. Very few, I think, in life require an extended amount of thinking and decision-making ability and contemplation and consulting and reviewing and discussing and going one way and then going the other way. But there are those. Everyone has them. They can go from anywhere from where to live, who to marry, what kind of work to do, which friends to have on one level, And then there are situations where moral decision making needs to come up in a person's life where they have to make a decision. They have to choose maybe between two paths. They have to choose to do something or to say no and not do something. We've talked a lot about sort of the moral aspects of it. What I'm curious in pursuing today is what makes that tip. What tips it from one side to the other, or what moves it from ambiguity or indecision to decision? There's a tipping point there. That term tipping point was made famous by none other than Malcolm Gladwell in the book he had called The Tipping Point. I read it a couple of times. I think it's super interesting. There's a lot in there. The concept of the tipping point is the idea of understanding of how ideas and products and behaviors spread like wildfire once they reach some sort of a critical mass. And so in the book, he goes through a variety of examples, which are interesting. Famously, he does a whole piece on hush puppy shoes and how that became like a fashion trend and a thing. But there's a lot of other examples. He does, I think, an interesting deep dive on Paul Revere and how the Paul Revere story was a tipping point in the story of the revolution in America. I think a lot of what's going on now for a lot of people in the world also is on some level forcing people to make decisions. It's tipping people one way or the other, and it's really not leaving room for people to be on the sides. People talk about the idea that it's forcing people to make choices and to choose sides. I think in life there are situations that require people to make choices and to choose. Which side are you on? I'm not necessarily looking at a binary like, either you're with us or you're against us. But to some degree, thinking in that domain, in that vein, I definitely think that that's a thing. And sometimes we have to decide what we are and who we are and where we are and who we're with and so on and so forth. So tipping points is really important. And so how do we sort of understand how it moves from, in the case of Gladwell, where it moves from a very few number of people, and then it moves from a few people to almost like spreading into like the web of people, and then it's so many people and so pervasive and inescapable that it becomes almost like, as he describes in the book, like an epidemic, like a virus that spreads into an epidemic. Now, we also witnessed that over the last number of years, something that started out a few number of people in a couple of locations, and then it felt like it just took over the world. And so you're able to study it in the story of viruses and epidemics. And a little bit, Gladwell goes through the idea of understanding how it works with respect to ideas or products. But I'm curious, in a more specific and unique case for an individual who has to make a decision, what tips that decision one way or the other? What factors are necessary to be there or eliminated for that to happen, let's say? So let's give you an example. You're at a job, you don't like it. You've been there a couple of years, you've progressed a little bit, you have people around you that you like, you've worked hard, you've gotten some raises, you've gotten some promotions. But generally speaking, you're not happy, or it's not an avenue or a direction of work that you want to pursue for the rest of your life. But it works. It's stable. It provides for the people in your life. Then an opportunity comes your way that is fraught with a little bit of risk. You have to take a little bit of risk to do it. You have to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. But the upside in the long term could be tremendous for you. So what tips the decision to go or not go? So to not go, I get, because I think most people in many of those decisions simply just choose not to engage. But what moves you to say, you know what, I'm doing it. I'm going to take that risk. I'm going to go. I'm going to, what the term is, I'm going to jump. I read a book over the summer called When to Jump. It talks about people who were in one career and decided to shift careers into something really, in most cases, very different. Sort of their process in how to do it. The person who wrote the book name is Michael Lewis, started out as a banker and ended up being a squash player and ended up becoming a writer. So it talks about when to jump. How does that work? And what tips a person in the decision-making process to go from what they're doing to something completely different in a completely different place in the world that changes them fundamentally as a human being. So he went from being a banker to becoming a squash player. So interesting book. So when to jump, how does that work? The reason it comes up for me this week, particularly with respect to Jacob, is that in this week's reading, we learn about the development and the growth of Jacob's family and the maturation of the person known as Jacob. And so as last week's story ended and he's on the run, he's fleeing his brother and his mother sends him away and gets the blessing from his father, and now he's there and he's building a family, he's married, he has children, he's there. And I would say that life is pretty good. He escaped the wrath of his brother. His life where he is not in danger. He's married. He has many, many children. He is quite successful as a shepherd for his father-in-law and his father-in-law's business. And so he could stay there forever. Except that there's this idea that he's going to come back. Something he talked about at the beginning when he has the dream. Something his mother talked about last week's portion when she sends him away and says, stay there until I bring you back. So what happens? What happens to Jacob that he makes the decision that it's time to go back? So the first time we see it is in the 30th chapter. The 30th chapter in the 25th verse, his wife Rachel gives birth to her first child. It's the 11th child to be born, the 11th of the tribes to be born, 12th child overall to be born. Let's not forget the daughter Dinah. Joseph is born. And immediately upon Joseph's birth, Jacob makes a decision. It's time to go. Something has tipped. Something has changed. The status quo, which was in place until that moment, has changed. And now he's made a decision, and he makes that decision public. Now, a lot of the case with our own lives, when we have these big decisions to make, we don't go public with them. We don't announce them to people necessarily because of repercussions or reverberations or, anything that could happen to us. So Jacob going to Laban and saying to him, it's time for me to go, free me, send me home, is a massive statement. Because it means he's going to leave, and his wives are going to leave, and his children are going to leave, and the flocks are going to leave, and Laban's best shepherd, who's made him enormously successful and wealthy, is also leaving. And he says it out loud. Something changed. So you could say that it's the fact that this child Joseph is born and he sees something uniquely in the child. You could say that now that there's a child, minimally one child born to each of the wives, then it's sufficient for him to go back. It could be that he realizes and looks at it and says, enough already, I need my own space, I need my own flock, I need my own wealth, and he's breaking away. It's a whole host of ways to sort of understand it, but he makes that statement, time for me to go. And then it doesn't happen. Laban is either too crafty or too smart, too creative, whatever you want to call it. He gets Jacob to stay. He says to him, name your price. Name your price. And Jacob does. In a roundabout manner. But he names his price. He does the whole thing with the animals, and ultimately he becomes a very wealthy person. But he doesn't go. I think that's true for many of us. There are many things in our mind that we've decided in our head that we don't actually follow through on, that we don't actually make true, that we don't actually fulfill. Even though mentally we have made the decision. In some cases in our lives, we never make the decision. We never decide. We sit and stew inside that dilemma, on the tip of that needle, leaning one way, leaning the other, going back and forth, staying up late at night, unable to sleep, not sure what to do. And then, through inertia, the decision is made for us and we do nothing. That's so many of us in so many cases in so many situations. However, in the case of Jacob, it in fact does happen. He gets another chance at this years later. In the 31st chapter, the beginning of the chapter, after just describing how wealthy Jacob has become, it comes up again. Because the reality that we know about these mega decisions in our lives is that they really don't go away. They only move from being an actual decision to being a massive source of regret. But they're sort of always there. In the case of Jacob, this issue rears its head again some years later. Now he's been there, let's say, close to 20 years, you would say. He's very wealthy, he has his wives, he has his children. What changes now? What changes now is not simply that he's made the decision to go. Other factors in the decision-making process change as well. The context, the environment around him has shifted. The ground has changed. The people have changed. Take a look at the text at the beginning of the 31st chapter. It talks about the sons of Laban speaking about Jacob behind his back, talking about the fact that he's a liar and a cheat and a thief. He took all that belonged to their father. It's a libel. It's a falsehood. But maybe it's believable. And he knows that they're saying it. 1. 2. He senses in some way, in verse 2, that Laban himself has changed and he's no longer with him the way he was the day before. Something has shifted in the person. Now, that could be because of the whisperings that are going on around about Jacob, the false rumors about his behavior and his actions, the fake news around Jacob. The sons are putting out tweets about him, rumors, innuendo, stories. Jacob is reading not just between the tea leaves, he sees the tea leaves and he sees what's changed. I feel like maybe many of us have had that experience. Maybe you worked for someone or had a friend, suddenly something's off. Their affect is different towards you. Their interaction, the way they speak to you, the way they talk to you, the way they operate around you, the way they include you or don't include you changes. And you feel that little breeze, the little wind around you. I've had that a couple of times in work years ago. It's felt like, something's different today. It's a feeling that's stuck. The person's changed towards me. What does that do? What does that do to you? How does that change you? What does that do with respect to your decision-making process? What does that force you into that maybe you didn't want to do before? So that context rears its head again, and now it's back. And then the third thing that happens here to Jacob is that God speaks to him. And that's usually just a clincher. God speaks to him and tells him, okay, man, it's time to go home. Go back to your land, to the land of your father, and I'll be with you. And the fourth thing that happens to him is that he consults with his wives and they agree it's time to go. They say to him, we have nothing here. We've been wiped out of the will. We have nothing to inherit. Our children will get nothing. If you say it's time to go, we're going with you. It's time to go. Let's go. And so what we understand now with respect to Jacob is that the entire world that surrounds him, the entire ground that's around him shifts. Unbelievably so in a very short period of time. And now there is no choice, let's say, but to go, and he goes. Differently than before, whereas before he announced it to Laban, this time he sort of tries to steal away in the night. That doesn't go so well. That's a story for a different time. But what tipped? What tipped here for Jacob was something that was on his mind, that was a thing that's in his mind that he's been thinking about for years, which he had sort of put to bed, which was not going to be a thing for a moment. The environment and other factors around him bubbled to the surface. The decision came back to bear. He looked around, and he decided to go. Some of the commentaries talk about the fact that what if he doesn't have all those different factors? Does he still go? It's a really interesting question. What if God doesn't speak to him? Does he still try to do it? That would make him more Abrahamic in nature. Abraham, the spiritual revolutionary that I mentioned 3 years ago, the idea that Abraham is speaking and talking and debating about God in front of others before God speaks to him, that's a person jumping into risk. So maybe that's the case. What if his wives aren't convinced that it's time to go? Will he still go? Will he take them with him? Will he force them to go? Will he drag them along? Will he leave them behind? But it's the conglomeration of all those, the confluence of all those factors that help him make the decision that it's time to go. And that's super interesting, and I think it's super important. To appreciate that when we're talking about tipping points, and not just the Gladwellian types of tipping points, and how he sort of builds that this is a thing for us as individuals, as leaders. Talking about in the leadership space is an entire sort of theory around tipping point leadership that's built by those who wrote the Blue Ocean Strategy of how a person can sort of sense the trends, get ahead of the trends, be ahead of the tipping point. And talk deeper inside the idea about the early influencers. What does it mean to have the people who in the tech world might be called early adapters, people who go for it first, who begin to set the trend, who are, let's say, those who are early to a quote-unquote a virus or early to a product. And then it sort of goes from there to the next group and beyond. That's all those things. In the case of an individual having to make a decision and something has to tip, something will always tip. It's just a question of whether the person decides to make the decision. And as I mentioned before, the chance that a person will not make the decision and the decision will be made for them and what they end up living with is no longer a tipping point, but a massive amount of regret. So if that's you, and that's where you are at the moment, you're sitting between two jobs. You're living in a place you don't like. You have certain relationships in your life that aren't going well, and you've been sitting on them and you've been stuffing them under the rug, and you're not communicating about them, and you're not working on them, and you're not developing them, and you're not making them better. So indecision or a lack of decision is a decision. But I'm curious for you, and I'm curious for me, in those decisions, what will make you tip? What will make you decide? What will make you say yes to that new opportunity? What will make you say no to that new opportunity? What will make you say, I have to do work here to build this and make this better? What will make you say, this relationship is not where I want it to be, where I need it to be? How do I make it better? Let me communicate that and step into that discomfort, because part of it is discomfort. We know that, to make it better. Maybe I'm living somewhere I don't want to live. It's not helping me grow spiritually. I'm not happy here or there or wherever it may be. And you need to change. That decision is hard because it comes with so much unknown. But what's going to make it tip? Do you need God to speak to you? Do you need the people who are closest to you, around you, to be in that decision? If that's true, have that conversation. Is the environment around you shifting and the landscape around you shifting to the degree by which you look at it and think, this is no longer comfortable, this is no longer good, this is no longer what it was, I can't lie to myself anymore? If any of those factors are true, then it's a time that you're sitting on a tipping point with respect to a decision that has to be made. But don't let indecision be the decider for you. Make the decision. Choose. One way or the other, make a decision on that. 10 with a quote. This is a quote from Malcolm Gladwell from the book. because I think it's super important to appreciate where this goes and how this works. It goes and it works for good things in the world and bad things in the world, and we have the opportunity and the potential and the ability to make amazing things happen by small changes, by making small things tip in a certain direction to make things improved. And here's the quote: "In the end, tipping points are a reaffirmation of the potential for change and the power of intelligent action. Look at the world around you. It may seem like an immovable, implacable place. It is not. With the slightest push in just the right place, it can be tipped." That is Coaching with the Bible for this week. Look forward to seeing you guys next week.